founded in London in 1933 with the aim of advancing education, knowledge, and learning in all aspects of the science of Marxism, the history of socialism, and the working class movement generally. The library is home to a unique collection of published and archival sources on subjects including trade unionism, the peace movement, solidarity movements, and the Spanish Civil War. Our education program, both online and indeed in normal times on site, ranges from working class history to Marxist political economy to socialist art. The library itself is a historic building rooted in the local radical tradition of Clerkenwell. We are an educational charity and we're financed by our members and affiliates. We welcome new members who apply to join us, and you can apply online via our website. Just a brief comment to everyone here to ask you to keep your cameras switched off during the talk, because it helps to preserve bandwidth and improves the audibility. I want to, before I just introduce Robert properly, I'll flag up a couple of forthcoming events at the library. On Thursday, the 27th of August, 3 weeks' time, at 7 p.m. London time, Marx Memorial Library will host an online panel discussion entitled Race and Class, exploring the current political context, the intersection of race and class oppression, and the development of our education work at MML. The panel of speakers includes Claudia Webb, MP for Leicester East, who is a trustee of Marx Memorial Library, who will be speaking on the Black Lives Matter movement and the current political climate. Roger Mackenzie, the Assistant General Secretary of Unison, who will be speaking in a personal capacity on the intersection of race and class oppression. And Alan Kuna, a history teacher from Newham Sixth Form College in East London, talking specifically about Newham Sixth Form College's collaborative work with Marx Memorial Library on Black history and anti-colonial struggles. And then a month later, on Thursday, the 24th of September, 2020, at 7 p.m, we present another online panel on American radical publishing, 1917 to 1945, and the Marx Memorial Library collection. And our panel there includes Jodie Collins, who is currently undertaking a collaborative PhD with the British Library and Sussex University, researching pamphlets of the American Communist movement, and Dr. Sue Carell, who is a reader in American literature based at Sussex University, focusing primarily on America in the 1920s and 30s. Marx Memorial Library is home to the John Williamson collection, which comprises a phenomenal archive of Communist Party USA pamphlets and periodicals. Registration for both of those events is through our Marx Memorial Library website. Details are in the chat. Finally, for those of you who've browsed our online archive of books, periodicals, posters, pamphlets, and newspapers, you'll know what a remarkable resource Marx Memorial Library provides for the labour movement and researchers on all aspects of the history and culture of Marxism, communism, socialism, and the science of Marxism. So this is a plug. Join the Marx Memorial Library. Details are on our website. So on to the subject of tonight's lecture. The Marx Memorial Library in Clerkenwell, London, is the only surviving building in Britain intimately associated with the work of Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, Lenin. Vladimir Ilyich Lenin visited London on 6 occasions at the very beginning of the 20th century, and it was in this city where Marx wrote Das Kapital that the roots of Lenin's political thought took shape. Many of the key actors in this story were associated with the Social Democratic Federation, the SDF, the first self-declared Marxist political party in Britain, the SDF print shop, the 20th Century Press was based at 37A Clerkenwell Green from the 1880s, which today is the home of the Marx Memorial Library. The 20th Century Press was founded by the Social Democratic Federation as its printer for a weekly journal called Justice, and perhaps through the good offices of a Russian-born SDF member, Theodor Rothstein, Lenin used these offices to edit editions of his all-Russian socialist newspaper, Iskra, The Spark, when he arrived in London with Nadezhda Krupskaya in April 1902. Bob Henderson, the author of the new publication that is the subject of this evening's book launch, tells the story for the first time of Lenin's intriguing relationship with the enigmatic Apollinaria Yakubova, a revolutionary known to her comrades as the primeval force of the Black Earth. Bob Henderson has an academic and professional background in Russian and Slavonic languages and was Russian curator at the British Library. He completed his doctoral research into Russian political emigration in late 19th century London in 2009, and this book is the fruit of that work. Until recently, he lived near King's Cross Station in London, the area identified at the time as the Russian colony, and where Lenin and Krupskaya lived. Drawing on original archival research for his book, Bob Henderson traces Lenin's London-based accomplices and political rivals and sheds new light on his developing worldview at this time, one which would have such a crucial impact on the 20th century. Thanks very much for joining us and giving this lecture tonight, Bob, and over to you.
Thanks very much, Alex, and good evening to everyone. My first thanks go to Alex, Marion, and the Marx Memorial Library for offering to host this launch. I'm extremely grateful, and given the associations of the library with Lenin and the Russian revolutionary movement, I couldn't really have asked for a better location. And I'll come back to some of these links between Lenin and the library in the course of my talk. I'd also like to express my thanks to the staff at Bloomsbury Taurus for all the work they put into the book. And I must give a special mention to Thomas Hoskins, the senior commissioning editor at IB Taurus, for it was really thanks to his persistence and his mastery of techniques of persuasion that I eventually gave in and agreed to produce a manuscript for him. One reviewer assumed that the book was a rewrite of my PhD thesis, but in fact it's a commission work based on my 30-odd years of research into Lenin and the Russian political emigration. It was an earlier book of mine, a biography of the revolutionary Vladimir Burtsev, that I based partly on my doctoral thesis. The spark that lit the revolution first saw the light of day over 4 months ago, just as the country was going into lockdown. And so there was never any question of an official launch at the time. Now it would appear that online launches such as this have become the norm. And I wonder indeed if it will ever be possible to revert back to the traditional kind in front of a live audience. But there are some benefits of having a launch via Zoom. For example, I'm told there are around 150 participants this evening. That's probably more than I could have hoped for at a traditional bookshop event. Also, a delayed launch such as this gives people the opportunity to have read the book in advance and so to come armed with more specific and pertinent questions. And I look forward to trying to answer some of these at the end. However, a word of warning. One reviewer commented that the book put human flesh on the intellectual and political bones of Lenin. And that's exactly what I was attempting to do, to focus on Lenin the man rather than Lenin the political philosopher or Lenin the Marxian economist. If anyone has questions on either of these aspects of the man, you may find that my answers will be less than complete. But let's press on. What I'd like to do this evening is to give you a flavour of the book and show you examples of some of the new archival discoveries it contains. And there are quite a few. I've also dug out a couple of old maps, which I hope will throw some light on Russian revolutionary London during the Edwardian period, because as you'll find out, Russian London itself is a major character in the book. But first, I'd like to say a few words about how my interest in Lenin and the Russian revolutionary of the British Museum, where I was lucky enough to discover a previously unknown set of letters relating to Lenin's admission to the museum library in 1908. I describe in the book how I suggested to the archivist where he might want to look, and how a few minutes later he returned with a little packet of letters tied up in a delicate pink ribbon, and he gave me the honour of opening it. What I discovered inside was not one, but 2 letters from Vladimir Ilyich to the director of the museum. That discovery sparked some press interest, with articles appearing in The Observer and even in Izvestia. But happy though I was with the newspaper coverage, that was as nothing compared to the absolute thrill of the moment of discovery itself. To be the first person in almost 80 years to hold these unique documents in my hand, and to read Lenin's words, written in his own neat handwriting, seemed to bring the man back to life. And if you'll bear with me, I'll try to show you one of these letters now. So this is the original photograph of one of these historical documents, as supplied to me by the British Museum Reprographic section way back then. I'm not sure how legible it will be to you, so let me read it out. To the director of the British Museum, I am writer by profession. I have sent to the British Museum from Geneva, where I am usually living, 2 of my Russian books. My pen name is Ilin. I came now in London in order to study comparatively New English and New German philosophy. I enclose a written recommendation from a London householder, and I should be very much obliged if you would give me admission ticket to the reading room of the British Museum. Signed V.L. Ulyanov, 21 Tavistock Place, London, and it's dated 18th of May, 1908. So this was part of my great discovery. All in all, a fairly bland letter at first glance. During his first visit to London, both Lenin and his wife, Nadezhda Krupskaya, had taken English lessons. But 6 years had elapsed since then, so I think we can forgive the odd spelling mistake and grammatical slip. But what's of much more interest here is the reference to the London householder, who had acted as Lenin's referee. And this is where a couple of Marx Memorial Libraries connections come into play. The gentleman in question went by the name of J.J. Terrett, and it's interesting that in all the voluminous biographical information that's been compiled on Lenin, nowhere is this name to be found. Initially, I couldn't find much out about this mysterious individual either, and so I wrote to Andrew Rothstein, former secretary of the Marx Memorial Library, who quickly got back to me. He told me that, quite remarkably, he personally remembered Joe Terrett, as he was known to his comrades, as an active organizer in the SDF, and also as a particularly violent anti-German propagandist at the outbreak of the war. What's more, Terrett wrote the occasional article for Justice, and also had a pamphlet published by the 20th Century Press. How he ended up acting as a referee for Vladimir Ilyich is difficult to say, but I assume that when Lenin arrived in London, he would have made a beeline for Clerkenwell Green to ask his comrade of 6 years, Harry Quelch, the manager of the press, if he could help him gain admission to the museum. I can only guess that Quelch wasn't available, but that Joe Terrett happened to be in the building at the time and offered his services. As it turned out, for a variety of reasons, the museum rejected Terrett's recommendation as unsatisfactory, and so Lenin had to hurry back to get another letter from Quelch, which thankfully the authorities accepted. Lenin could now begin his researches, which would result a year later in the publication of his book, Materialism and Imperial Criticism. Now, this is just one episode from Lenin's time in London, but it's quite an unusual one, for it involved him in having dealings with not one, but 2 Englishmen. It's known that during his first stay in the capital from 1902 to 03, Lenin kept himself pretty much to himself. Most of his time he would spend either in his little office in Clerkenwell Green or at the museum. He would meet up only occasionally with those other emigres who were associated with his newspaper Iskra, but as far as the natives were concerned, he avoided contact whenever possible. He also had very little to do with those Russians who had settled in London before his arrival, although there are 2 very important exceptions to this rule, which I'll come on to shortly. As I continued my work in the museum archives, I discovered more and more applications from a whole range of Russian emigre revolutionaries. In fact, I think in the end, I had amassed a file of almost 100 letters. Of course, since the early 19th century, the museum library had been regarded as a place of sanctuary for a whole host of political refugees from all over Europe, and perhaps the most famous among them was Karl Marx. Now, it was known that Marx had become a reader shortly after his arrival in London, but no confirmation had been found in any of the museum's registers. Then a few years ago, I came across this curious entry in the Register of Admissions for the 12th of June, 1850. fourth line down. But the original name there is actually for a Dr. Charles Mars, as in the planet. You can see that at some later date, the surname was amended, with the final S being scored through and replaced with an X. Unfortunately, this error in transcription, which occurred no doubt thanks to Marx's notoriously illegible handwriting, was also carried over into the index to the register, and it's possibly for this very simple reason that the record of Marx's historic arrival in the reading room had remained undiscovered. Now, further along that line, after his solo address, you'll see the name of a Dr. William Plate, who served as Marx's referee on his first admission. But unfortunately, we must press on. I won't say any more about the fascinating but ultimately tragic life of this gentle man. But I did publish a paper on it a number of years back, and I can pass on the details to anyone who might be interested. But let's return now to Edwardian London. Close this down for a bit. Now, Lenin and his comrades were, of course, well aware of Marx's association with the museum. And so for many, it had become every bit as much a place of pilgrimage as had Marx's grave in Highgate Cemetery. And I'm fairly sure that they would have experienced a certain thrill when they followed in their mentor's footsteps and entered for the first time under the famous domed reading room. My researches in the archive showed that during their stay in London, many of these emigres chose to live in the area around King's Cross Station. Others preferred Hammersmith, and yet others chose Whitechapel, an area which was known then as the Little Russian Island, the Ruski Ostrovok. And we'll pay a visit to that area later. But first, to give you an idea of just how popular the King's Cross area was amongst Lenin and his comrades, I'd like to show you a map, an Ordnance Survey map, which this one actually dates from 1914, but I don't think there were too many major changes over the preceding decade or so. I hope that's clear enough. First, let me show you the location of Lenin's flat during his stay in 1908. It was just down here in Tavistock Place, just round about there. That was extremely well placed for the British Museum. A mere 10 minutes walk would have taken from Tavistock Place, left onto Woburn Place, then a short walk down to Russell Square, and beyond Russell Square, he would get to Great Russell Street and to the grand entrance to the British Museum, which is just about a block further to the south of this map. Now let me show you some other points of interest. Up here to the top is King's Cross. This is the main area where the Russians congregated. Lenin spent most of his 1902-3 visit over here in Holford Square. Again, a mere 20 minutes walk or so would take him to the reading room, and a just slightly longer one, south on Farringdon Road, down here, would take him to Clerkenwell Green, which again is just off the map down here. He evidently liked the area because when he returned in 1905 for the Third Party Congress, he stayed just round the corner at 16 Percy Circus, which is absolutely there exactly. Now that address in turn was only a few doors away from number 23 Percy Circus, which in 1902 had served as the second home of what was known as the Iskra Commune. Two of the communards were Yuli Martov and Vera Zasulich, both members of the editorial board of Lenin's newspaper, Iskra. The commune had first established itself just here, on 14 Sidmouth Street, where Martov and Zasulich had been joined by other Iskraites, such as Lev Deutsch, one of the co-founders of the Emancipation of Labour group, and briefly, Lev Trotsky. This somewhat bohemian and lively dwelling was a popular port of call for visiting social democrats, such as George Plekhanov, who, however, would not have dreamed of spending the night in what he described as a squalid den. It's more than likely that it was as a result of complaints from neighbours about noise and general disorder that the commune was obliged to find new premises. There are many, many more locations on this map with a Russian revolutionary connection, such as one of Lenin's favourite restaurants. Adam's Chop House was just here at King's Cross. But no location is more important, I think, than Regent Square, which is just here, and number 20 in particular. During the Second World War, the square suffered extensive bomb damage, but fortunately, the southern side, pictured here, survived relatively unscathed, as did the gardens themselves with their dozen or so majestic London plane trees. And it was to this peaceful spot that Lenin and Krupskaya were conveyed when they first arrived in London in 1902. And it was here, at number 20, that they were reintroduced to a young emigre couple that they'd first met some 10 years earlier in St. Petersburg. On their arrival in London in 1899, that young couple had adopted the pseudonyms of Robert and Paulina Tarr. Now, I make no apologies for the space I devote to the Tarrs in my book, or to give them their real names, Konstantin Takhtaryov and his wife, Apollinaria Yakubova. Their relationship to Lenin during that 1902 to 03 period was so intense and intimate, it's quite surprising that until now it's hardly received a mention in the literature. But this is probably because during the post-revolutionary period, both Takhtaryov and Yakubova had been virtually written out of the official history books. And this despite the fact that in the 1890s, Yakubova had been a founding member, together with Lenin, of a small influential revolutionary circle, which eventually grew to become the RSDLP, the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party. The eradication of their memory was so complete that historians were not sure even what the young revolutionaries had looked like. For a long time, it was thought that no photograph of Apollinaria had survived. But fortunately, a few years ago, in the Russian archives, I managed to find not one, but two such photographs. And here's one of them, alongside a photograph of her beloved husband. Both of these photos date from the early 1890s in St. Petersburg. Soon after these discoveries appeared in the press, I was absolutely thrilled to receive an email from Almaty in Kazakhstan, home of one of Yakubova's distant relatives, Mrs. Irina Borisovna Dudnik, who generously gave me access to the revolutionary's personal papers, which in turn allowed me to tell her story for the first time. Pretty much all that had been known previously about Apollinaria amounted to a vague rumour that at some point Lenin had made a proposal of marriage to her and had been turned down. And I discuss this issue at length in my book, before I move on to look at their London relationship. Now, Takhtaryov and Yakubova helped the new arrivals in so many ways, one wonders if Lenin could have survived without them. As Krupskaya recalled, she and Lenin were at the Takhtaryovs all the time, всё время, which is very often translated in Krupskaya's memoir. It's translated as most of the time or often. But no, всё время, they were there all the time. And not only did the young couple help them find accommodation, they also acted as interpreters and assisted Lenin in setting up the production of his newspaper in Clerkenwell Green. Moreover, Krupskaya also mentioned that it was Takhtaryov who was responsible for the organisation of the 1903 Second Party Congress in London, at which the famous Bolshevik-Menshevik split would occur. And it's doubtless a testament to the meticulous planning carried out both by Takhtaryov and indeed by his wife, that to this day, the exact locations of the Congress meetings remain unknown. Clearly, the Takhtaryovs had already mastered the art of konspiratsia, which in Russian doesn't mean conspiracy, but rather has a specific meaning of something like the ability to avoid detection. So let us now stay with that concept of konspiratsia and move on to Lenin's 1905 visit and say a few words about the surveillance operations which were going on in London at that time. It's often claimed that Lenin was a master conspirator who seemed to have the uncanny ability to move effortlessly around Europe without attracting any attention at all. And the April 1905 London Congress is often cited as proof of that skill. All that was known about the event was, as I mentioned earlier, Lenin's address at 16 Percy Circus, and also the location of the first session of the Congress, which was held in a pub, the Crown and Woolpack. That was just a few minutes' walk away from Lenin's flat up at the Angel Islington. It was here that an intrepid young special branch detective claimed to have hidden in a cupboard while that meeting was going on. But it's also been claimed, incidentally, that the young sleuth's attempt at eavesdropping proved unsuccessful, since he couldn't understand Russian, the language in which, unsurprisingly, proceedings were being conducted. I do rather doubt there's any truth in that claim, however. But that aside, that was just about all that was known about this event, which attracted around 30 delegates and which ran for 3 whole weeks. So you might think, a pretty effective piece of konspiratsia, of secret planning. But you would be wrong. For quite apart from the young lad from Special Branch, there was another somewhat more experienced agent lurking in the background. This agent would later report to his masters in Paris that on the very morning of that first session, an unidentified man had been spotted leaving the home of a well-known Russian revolutionary out in Hammersmith. That man had been tailed all the way to the Angel Islington, and there, at the door of the Crown and Woolpack, he had been admitted to an upstairs room by two well-known London émigrés who were standing guard at the outside door. From that day forward, the agent filed a meticulous series of reports covering the movements of the revolutionaries over the entire period, and not only pinpointed the 5 separate locations where the sessions took place, but also managed to find out the addresses of almost all of the participants. This individual was a Frenchman who went by the delightful name of Monsieur Farce, Monsieur Jean-Edgar Farce, who for several years already had served as the Russian secret police's man in London. And the Russian secret police at that time were based in the embassy in Paris, the Russian embassy in Paris. Now here we have an artistic representation of one of the Congress sessions. And I think the artist may well have based this illustration on that first session at the Crown and Woolpack. But I'd like to think that it's a representation of one of the later sessions, which took place in a pub called the Hare and Hounds, which was situated just past Islington Town Hall on Upper Street. And although it's undergone a series of name changes, the pub can still be easily identified by the frieze on the second floor facade, depicting a beleaguered hare pursued by a pack of threatening hunting dogs. And here's a photograph I took recently. I would like to imagine Lenin holding forth in one of these rooms. It's difficult to imagine a more fitting image, in fact, bearing in mind that not only the Russian and British political police, but also the French Sûreté had taken on the role of bloodhound and were all intent in hunting down and destroying the Russian revolutionary movement in its infancy. Agents of the French police spent much of their time conducting surveillance operations out in London's East End, in the original little Russian island. This was the stamping ground, no, beg your pardon. This was the stamping ground of one particular individual whom the French didn't want to let out of their sight. So far, we haven't paid a visit out there, and it's important we do, because Lenin was a frequent visitor and was also well acquainted with the individual in question. The archives of the Sûreté Générale in Paris contain a series of absolutely fascinating reports compiled by one of their London agents in early 1902, in which the political emigre associations in England, and in which the startling claim was made that a little library in Church Lane was the rallying centre of the Russian revolutionary movement in London. Moreover, the manager of that library was deemed to be one of the most influential members of the Revolutionary Party here. The agent had in mind Monsieur Alexei Lvovich Tcheplov, a radical revolutionary who in Paris in 1890 had been arrested during the so-called Paris bomb plot, an affair which had been orchestrated by an agent provocateur in the employ of the Foreign Agency of the Russian police. As a result, a French prison before moving to London and apparently turning over a new leaf. The French, however, were not convinced and kept him under surveillance for years to come. And moreover, they shared their suspicions with Scotland Yard, who were more than happy to share in the surveillance operation. If you add to this mix the omnipresent London Ochrana agents, you can imagine what a crackling hotbed of revolution Whitechapel represented at this time. And it may come as a surprise to many to learn of the extent to which these agencies were prepared to cooperate with each other when it was a question of keeping an eye on the Russian revolutionaries. I'll give you one example, that of Detective Sergeant Michael Thorpe, who on his retirement from Special Branch, at the suggestion of his own head of the CID, was recruited by the foreign section of the Russian secret police as an assistant to Monsieur Farce on an annual salary of £450, not an inconsiderable amount. And not only that, for his retirement from the post, Thorpe was actually awarded a pension by the Russian Department of Police. Anyway, here's a photograph of Tcheplov, one of the main objects of this joint surveillance, alongside the stamp of that free Russian library which he founded in the heart of London's Russian East End in 1898. A year or so after the library's foundation, when the Takhtaryovs arrived in London, they, like many other émigrés, soon found their way out to Whitechapel. Apollinaria in particular immediately bonded with this gentle giant of a man, and thus began an extremely fruitful partnership. Lenin too is known to have visited the library, probably at the suggestion of the Takhtaryovs, and he too developed a lasting friendship with the old librarian. And again, this is somewhat unusual, for not only did Tcheplov belong to an earlier generation of émigrés, he was also affiliated to the Socialist Revolutionaries, who were complete anathema to Lenin and his Social Democrats. But here I'd like to read you a Russian journalist's evocative description of what visitors would have encountered when they turned up at Teplov's library. They arrived at a rickety-looking house, the wall of which was bellying out. Above the door hung a blue notice board with the sign Russian Odessan Restaurant, which also carried an inscription in Yiddish to the effect that the food was kosher. Below the sign was another which read, Besplatnaya Ruskaya Biblioteka. The entrance was anything but inviting. Visitors had to grope their way along a dark corridor which stank of cabbage and fried fish, emanating no doubt from the restaurant. Then they had to climb a staircase which presented a dangerous ascent. Not only had someone poured dishwater down it, but many of the banisters were missing, taken no doubt by the poor to feed their stoves during the bitterly cold nights. On each landing were doors giving on to filthy little workshops inhabited by cobblers and tailors. The library itself made a disheartening impression. Everything carried the imprint of desperate poverty, or rather destitution. The sad little tables, the rough benches, and in particular the huge numbers of members of the public burrowing in newspapers and books. Most were unemployed, poorly dressed, pale, and in all likelihood starving, as they silently leafed through the pages of the Russian and Jewish newspapers on offer. Along the walls, rows of books were arranged on shoddily built, homemade bookcases. For the library's visitors in this distant foreign land, these books represented a precious memento of their homeland. These poor unfortunates, driven from the ghetto by extreme poverty and sometimes by terrible bloody catastrophe, lived and breathed the memory of their homeland and cherished its language. A door led from the large room into a smaller one, which was even filthier and stuffier, piled up to the ceiling with books and dusty bundles of old newspapers. There, crouched behind a little table, a young ginger-haired lad sat with a delicate, sickly countenance, engrossed in his bookbinding. There too they found the librarian, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a huge black beard, who carried an air of absolute authority over both rooms. Amidst all these stunted, sickly sons of the ghetto, he appeared as a colossus. Teplov and his free library were indeed at the very heart of Russian London. But he would soon branch out, and with Yakubova's help in particular, would set up a society which offered a series of lectures to the local inhabitants. These events, which took place in a venue which was aptly called Liberty Hall, situated just off Brick Lane, soon became extremely popular and began to attract a wide variety of lecturers, including in their number Lev Trotsky and Vladimir Ilyich himself, who in late November 1902 delivered a lecture on the program and tactics of the socialist revolutionaries. Konstantin Takhtaryov was present that evening and recalled that the hall was packed to capacity and that it felt like a sauna inside. Lenin's impassioned lecture lasted for 2 whole hours, during which time he never paused and never once looked at the faces in the audience, focusing instead on a point high up on the wall at the opposite end of the hall. At the end, soaked in sweat, Lenin rushed off to get a drink. Later, on their way home from Whitechapel, Takhtaryov queried him on his unique style of delivery and asked why he never looked at his audience. Well, Vladimir Ilyich replied, that's just in case the expression on their faces spoils my mood and breaks my train of thought. I always deliberately try not to look at the audience so that I'm not prevented from properly presenting my thoughts. Now I'd like to show you a map of the Whitechapel area. This is another Ordnance Survey one, and also dating from 1914, I believe. Now, the area around about here, around Commercial Road and Whitechapel Road, was at the very heart of Little Russia. There you could find Russian bathhouses, a Russian post office, all sorts of stores selling Russian produce, and so on. 15 Whitechapel Road, the first location of Teplov's library, was just here, opposite St Mary's Church. But very soon, it expanded and was obliged to move. And so it did just round the corner to Church Lane. Number 16 Church Lane was just here. Shortly thereafter, it had to move again across Whitechapel Road and up Brick Lane this time, which is just up here. Brick Lane begins there, to an even larger premises in Princeless Street, which is just off the map here. Now, interestingly, the building on Princeless Street still exists. And if you were to walk another couple of blocks to the north, you would come to the scene of Lenin's November 1902 lecture at Liberty Hall, in what was then called Pelham Street, which has now been renamed Woodseer Street, but unfortunately the building no longer exists. Another location of interest is just here, Toynbee Hall, where Lenin is known to have attended a lecture on British foreign policy given by the Liberal politician, the Right Honourable John Morley. It's said that Lenin stood up and in halting English asked Morley what was the point of talking about foreign policy in the East End of London, where no one cared about it and where the people were ground down by capitalism. In Lenin's opinion, British foreign policy was no more than pure imperialist exploitation. One final address of interest was way down here at number 106, which I think is just down here. 106 Commercial Road. This for a time was where Alexei Tyeplov lived, and a few years later it would serve as yet another home for his library. It also played an important role in 1907 as a meeting place and organisational centre for the 5th London Congress of the RSDLP. So let's now move on to that Congress. The 1907 Congress was about as far removed from the 1905 one as you could get. Rather than a mere 30 or so delegates, this time they were close on 350 in attendance. They came from all over Russia and from all of the major European centres of emigration. Now, the original intention had been to hold the Congress in Copenhagen, but they had been refused permission by the Danish authorities at the very last minute, and so were obliged quickly to seek out another venue. When the delegates eventually started to arrive in London in mid-May, it was clear to them that there was little chance of their proceedings being conducted in secrecy this time. And I do apologise for the poor quality of this slide, which was taken from the Daily Mail. As you can see, at least I hope you can see, the press reporters and photographers were out in force and pestered the delegates mercilessly on a daily basis outside the location of the Congress, which was held somewhat oddly in a church on Southgate Road in North London. What was rather curious about this whole setup was that, despite the massive press presence, no one seemed to know where this huge delegation actually stayed during the Congress. Stalin recalled his initial unsatisfactory lodgings along with a few others at Roton House on Fieldgate Street in the East End, which, if we just go back for a second, is just here, the Roton House. And also, it's also known that Lenin had booked a room for his guest Maxim Gorky at the recently built Imperial Hotel in Russell Square in Bloomsbury. But what of the others? It's not too easy to find accommodation in London at the best of times, but how do you house over 300 individuals at short notice? Moreover, the Copenhagen fiasco had severely impacted party finances, so they had to find somewhere that was both cheap and as near as possible to the Congress venue, to save on time and, more importantly, money. I'm fairly sure that I've now managed to track down that place, and I'd like to show you it here on another map, but this one dates from the 1890s. Now, way over here, you'll see the church. This is the Brotherhood Church on the corner of Balmes Road and Southgate Road. This is where the Congress was held from mid-May. I happened across a memoir left by one of the women delegates to the Congress, in which she expressed her indignity and indeed anger at the accommodation which the English authorities had offered them. She recalled that it was some disused army barracks, and I'm pretty sure that what she had in mind was this building way over here, on the west side of London Fields in Dalston. The barracks, which could accommodate up to 500 men, has served as the headquarters of the 7th Battalion of the Rifle Brigade, otherwise known as the King's Own Royal Tower Hamlets Militia, until they moved in September 1904 to Mill Hill Barracks in the north of London. The building has long since gone and has been replaced by some council housing, but I went out there a few months ago to try to imagine the delegates' daily journey to Southgate Road and back. I'm fairly sure they would have been obliged to make the journey on foot, and I think they would have come down here from the barracks. They would have walked down Shrubland Road until they got to Regent's Canal, and then it would be no more than a 10 or 15 minute walk along the towpath to the Brotherhood Church along here. It's difficult now to imagine the spectacle of hundreds upon hundreds of exotic bearded Russians trudging alongside a canal in North London and back for 3 weeks. Goodness only knows what the local residents must have made of it all. But as I say, there appears to be no mention of it in any press report I've come across, but maybe they were all versed in the art of conspiratia, who knows. An excellent source of information on Lenin's movements during and immediately after the 1907 Congress was the memoir of the Congress stenographer, a certain N. Karzhansky, who, once proceedings had ended, had the honour of spending a week together with Lenin working on the transcription and editing of the latter's Congress contributions. Where are we now? His memoir contains a wealth of detail concerning Lenin's habits and personality, and perhaps it may surprise some, but Karzhansky seems to have been particularly won over by the great man's sense of humour. And as an illustration, I'd like to read you a brief extract from the book. Each morning, having finished breakfast, they would climb, they would climb up to Lenin's room on the first floor to begin work. It was a modest, spotlessly clean little room with 2 windows looking out onto a tiny, well-maintained courtyard, and beyond onto factory chimneys and a misty, smoke-filled London morning sky. Unfortunately, Lenin and his stenographer would soon discover that their work would not always be plain sailing, brought about more often than not by the latter's incorrect transcriptions. And I should point out that Karzhansky had volunteered his services as stenographer, and he was by no means qualified. One such error gave cause for great merriment and demonstrated once more that Lenin was not always the deadly serious and driven individual as he's often portrayed. On reading through Karzhansky's record of his speeches to Congress during the third day's proceedings, Lenin was surprised to discover he had referred at one point in his delivery to a powerless duck. "A duck," he exclaimed. "What nonsense. I didn't say anything about a duck. That makes no sense whatsoever." "Well, you must have said something like it," I weakly attempted to defend myself. Lenin frowned and busied himself by consulting his own notes and comparing them to the transcribed version while pacing up and down the room, until suddenly I was deafened by a peal of laughter. He was seized by the kind of laughter which is too strong to resist and which takes over your entire body, from head to toe. A happy, loud, full and unconstrained laughter which can only end in tears. Lenin tried to speak but could only wave his arm helplessly. The laughter prevented him from uttering even one word. It transpired that Karzhansky had simply omitted one vowel in his transcription, and that his powerless duck, "Biesilnaya utka," should in fact have read "a weak subterfuge," "Biesilnaya utieka," this according to Karzhansky anyway. Eventually, the Bolshevik leader regained his composure and the two returned to their work. So there we have it, a rarely commented on aspect of Lenin's personality. But now if I can just bring back the original map of Whitechapel, I'll say a few more words. About Lenin's final visit to London in November 1911. In October 1911, Lenin had embarked on a tour of Europe, delivering a lecture entitled Stolypin and Revolution. And in one of his final ports of call was at the new King's Hall on the Commercial Road in Whitechapel on the 11th of November. This huge hall had housed some of the first lectures organised by Teplov and Yakubova way back in 1902. But a few years later, it had been converted into a 200-seat cinema. And here it is, way down here. You can see where it says cinema. And as you'll notice, it's just across the road, in fact, from number 106 Commercial Road, which I mentioned earlier. Now, sadly, absolutely nothing is known about Lenin's lecture. To the best of my knowledge, there were no reviews, and so we are completely in the dark as to how it was received and how many were present. Almost all that is known about this brief visit is that Lenin called again into the British Museum and there encountered an old comrade, the German socialist Max Beer. But by the end of the month, he was already back with Krupskaya in Paris. So, Lenin had arrived in Britain for the first time in 1902, and now, 9 years later, had left never to return. One cannot help but wonder what impressions the country and its capital had made on him over the years. Of course, long before his arrival, he'd formed firm opinions on the inequities of such bourgeois capitalist conurbations as London. The yawning divide between rich and poor, between the haves and the have-nots, the two nations that he'd brought to the attention of Trotsky and others. These views were hardly going to change now that he'd personally experienced the hardships of city life himself. Quite the reverse, his stay had merely served to reinforce these pre-existing beliefs. Max Beer would later make an interesting and perhaps appropriate comparison. To him, Lenin was a socialist Peter the Great, one who took from Western learning just as much as he needed for the transformation of Russia. And Though living and studying for years in Central and Western Europe and admiring much of what he found there, his heart and his spirit were always dwelling in his Russian land, in the midst of its workers and peasants. Now, just to finish off, there's been much discussion lately on the removal and destruction of monuments and plaques to certain individuals who have been shown to be undeserving of such memorials. And on that subject, I'd like to leave you with 2 slides. The first image appeared on the front page of the Morning Star on the 3rd of August 1968, and I'm most grateful to the Morning Star for giving me permission to reproduce this striking photograph in my book. The gentleman here, who seems to be breaking every health and safety rule in the book, is a Mr. Nick Lisi, a demolition worker, and the house in the photograph is none other than number 16 Percy Circus. However, all is not what it seems at first glance. For far from being destroyed, the fragile porcelain plaque commemorating Lenin's 1905 visit was being carefully removed before the house was demolished to make way for a commercial enterprise. The plaque itself was preserved and later presented to the mayor of Moscow. So, far from removing any trace of Lenin, his memory lived on in London. In fact, a second plaque was erected in the exact same place. And moreover, as recently as November 2012, Lenin was honoured once more with a new memorial, this time attached to the front of that very house in Tavistock Place where he stayed in 1908 and which I mentioned at the start of my talk. And I'd like to leave you with a final memento of that occasion. The gentleman in this photograph will be recognised by some, I'm sure. He is none other than the wonderful Professor Bill Fishman, former member of staff at my own college, Queen Mary, University of London. As those lucky enough to have experienced one of his East End tours will confirm, Bill was a veritable and literal walking encyclopedia of Russian revolutionary London. He was a man who could really bring the Russian Revolution to life. Sadly, he passed away at the age of 94 just a few years after this photograph was taken. But fortunately, others, such as in particular David Rosenberg, and more recently Sean Mitchell, have stepped in to take over Bill's role of revolutionary guide. And while we have such inspiring individuals in our midst, I think it's safe to say that in London at least, Lenin and the revolution will continue to live on. For my part, I hope that if you haven't read my book yet, you'll manage to get hold of a copy, and that, fingers crossed, you might agree with one reviewer who wrote that 150 years after Lenin's birth, the spark that lit the revolution does something to bring the man back to life. If you can come to that same conclusion, then I'll consider my work in the book to have been well worth it. And on that note, I'd like to stop there and thank you for your attention. I'd be happy to answer some questions now, but I'll also leave my email address up for a few seconds in case anyone would like to contact me directly. Thanks once again.
Well, can I thank you very much, Robert? That was terrific. Really, the use of ordnance survey maps, you know, even after a century of warfare, urban development, it really brings home to you the reality of how the people lived, where they met, how they discussed matters, and the work that you've done in uncovering that is fantastic. And the thought of 350 Russian revolutionaries walking down the Regent's Canal at 8 o'clock in the morning is it must have been quite a sight.
I think so.
So we've got a couple of people have popped some questions in while you've been talking, and I think there are more possibly just coming in at the moment. And I would encourage anyone who wants to put their question in the chat, and we'll ask it. A couple of questions about Lenin's time at the British Library and in London. Do we know what books he was reading and studying in the British Library? Is there any clue from the readers' tickets?
Unfortunately, well, if there is a section in my book, I do include an appendix in my book, which was reproduced from a little booklet that I wrote about Lenin at the library, way back in 1990, I think. And I did quite a bit of research at that time, looking through all the Lenin's materials to try to narrow down the list of works that he used. And I also found the press marks. So you can actually go back to the library and dig out the original books that he used. Moreover, in the same appendix, I include a list of the donations that he made to the library. He was so pleased and enjoyed the library so much, he made a point of donating, I think it was 5 or 6 of his own books, some of which bear his signature. Others were donated by his publisher. So yes, the information is there, and it's all in the book.
And just on that, the letter which you showed us in one of the earlier slides is signed Ulyanov, but the original reader's ticket that he applied for was in the name of Jacob Richter. Is that correct?
That's absolutely right. And an interesting little snippet about the Richter, the Dr. Jacob Richter, is that the English pronounced it as in, not as in Loch, but as in rich. So they were known as the Richters, which struck Takhtaryov as a very odd little quirk. His landlady in particular would always refer to them as the Richters. Yeah.
So
where he got that name from, I'm not quite sure.
But the pseudonym was used not just for applying for the British Library ticket, he used it also for his lodgings. And
that's right. Yeah. He remained as Jakob Richter throughout. In fact, he only dropped his pseudonyms in 1908, I believe, when he signed himself under the name Ulyanov. And I mentioned in the book that the reason I managed to discover the applications was a matter to do with Russian transliteration, the transliteration of Cyrillic into English. Certain library systems transliterate the Russian U as in Ulyanov as the English U. Other systems, such as the French and the European, transliterate the U as OU. So instead of looking under U for Ulyanov, we looked under O, and then lo and behold, there were the letters. Simple as that.
We've got somebody in the chat saying spasiba, but I'm afraid my Russian doesn't...
That was from my dear friend Irina Dudnik, who is responsible for the donating and giving me access to the Yakubova letters. I'm delighted to see her. And yes, to Ruda and Larissa.
So are we.
Thank you.
So can I just ask you also, somebody's asked, when Lenin was on the 6 occasions he was in London, did he ever get outside of London? Did he travel anywhere else in this country outside of London?
There was a rumour, which I've been unable to verify, that he on one occasion went up to one of the new towns, the name of which escapes me, but I couldn't verify that, and so I haven't included it in my book. I know that there has been some work done on it by Mrs. Philippa Parker. So if you'd like to get in touch with Philippa, I'm sure she'll be able to fill you in on that.
Somebody thinks
Letchworth, of course it is. Thanks, Mark. Yeah. Letchworth. That was apparently the name of the town. Yeah.
And Mark Blacklock has also said that your story of the powerless duck can't help remind him and us of the initial translation into English of the Communist Manifesto by Helen Macfarlane, which had there was a hobgoblin stalking Europe.
Yeah.
It was subsequently changed to a spectre. Somebody's asked if you wouldn't mind deviating from the book which you've just talked about, just telling us what happened to Mr. Plate.
Right. Now, the article that I wrote is available in the Electronic British Library Journal. It's called Dr. William Plate.
So just remind us who Mr. Plate was. I'm sorry, I should have said when I asked the question.
Dr. William Plate was Marx's first referee, and it was thanks to Dr. William Plate, who was a German national, living in London for a number of years. How Marx bumped into him, we're not quite sure. I discussed the options in my article. Unfortunately, Mr. Plate, or Dr. Plate, lost his wife at an early age. This seemed to impact on his life terribly, and he committed suicide in the most horrible way a year or so after his wife's death. It's interesting that, well, the details behind that are, as I say, are all included in the article, which is free via the Electronic British Library Journal. If you simply key in William Plate, Bob Henderson, you should pull it up, or Bob Henderson, Karl Marx.
Okay, thank you for that. Back to Lenin.
Okay.
I've got a couple of questions that have come in. So someone has asked, someone says, I have a deep respect for Lenin, but I consider it important to paint a picture of people we admire in their entirety, virtues and vices. So what is your stance on the Bauman affair and Lenin's position in this matter?
Oh. You know what? I don't have any position. I must say I'm not. The Bauman affair is not one I have to admit to that I'm particularly au fait with. So can I simply admit ignorance and pass on?
Can I say I'm not familiar with the Bauman affair either.
Okay.
Moving on. Someone says, we are often asked at Marx Memorial Library from people visiting the Lenin room, what was he like? From your detailed researches into his life, the way he lived, what he wrote, the people he spoke to, how would you describe Lenin the man in a few words?
One of the first things I think it would come across would be as a particularly driven individual who would be determined to get his own way. I think in his dealings with the Iskra editorial board, he showed that. At the same time, he was certainly a passionate man, as his relationship with Yakubova demonstrated. As for his later life, his rise to power in the Soviet Union again shows that drive, the determination, a certain ruthlessness. But at the same time, I try to show the other side of him. He did have a sense of humor, which may surprise people. He was known to, he was a passionate lover of aeroplanes, apparently. He would go out to, and outside Paris, he would go out to inspect airfields and so on. So he was a multifaceted individual, and I think it's too easy just to describe him simply as a ruthless individual with no redeeming features.
Indeed. So this is a question from Nina, and it's about the Russian emigre community in London. So you mentioned that on his first visit, Lenin kept his distance from his fellow emigrants. Could you say something about the demographic of Little Russia? Rich, were there any wealthy Russians here? Was it just the poorest Russians? Was it mainly political exiles? Were many of them economic migrants? Can you say something about the nature of the Russian communities?
Sure.
And you also, of course, mentioned on a number of occasions the Yiddish being spoken. So when we're talking about the Russians, we're also talking about Jewish people from Russia.
Of course.
So
that's right.
Can you talk something about that community and describe that in a bit more detail?
Certainly. I think it's important, first of all, to say, as I mentioned in the book, the London Russian community is best described as the Russian archipelago. There were 3 or 4 centres of Russian immigration. The East End was primarily the Yiddish, the Jewish immigration, which had arrived at the time of the purges in the 1880s, and they'd remained there near the ports, near the docks. There were other some wealthier Jews would move out to the north of London, Golders Green, as we know. So there's a lot of Russian Jewish community up there. Then there was another community out in Hammersmith, slightly more well-to-do, you could say, which were attached to 15 Augustus Road, and they had some people in their circle, such as a range of other revolutionaries, such as Stepniak, Kravchinsky, Volkhovsky, and so on. So it wasn't, there were rich and poor within the Russian communities. And the one that Lenin knew most of all was the one in the East. So I think, Vladimir's wanted to question as well. Great. So I think Lenin knew the East End better than any of the other areas. Obviously Bloomsbury, but that was more of a kind of a stop-off point for him to visit the British Library. Although the revolutionaries, I think, from the social democratic side were they were relatively rich in some respects. There was a lot of funds going into the banks. And of course, we know about Stalin's expropriations later on. So I think the Social Democrats were sometimes rich, sometimes poor.
Okay. Did you? I don't think you mentioned it, but in the Russian colony around King's Cross, there's of course by the time Lenin arrived in 1902, there was a good 50 years of activity by Russian political exiles. There was Herzen, Alexander Herzen,
Of course.
the Free Russian Press. And I think you mentioned as well in your book the Polish Democratic Press were based on
in Regent Square, yeah,
based in Regent Square as well. Could you say anything about those?
I could say something. Just dig out one of the notes I made. There are some excellent walks going on in London nowadays, and one is being conducted by Sean Mitchell, who I think goes into some detail about the earlier Russian emigration, including such as Herzen and so on. So yes, they were based there from about 1850. I think you could also look to Sarah Young's excellent articles and her map of Russian London. I'm hoping to add to that map, or at least draw up a separate Google map, an interactive map, which will be based on the locations, the new locations that I've found in the book and that are mentioned in the book. So that should add some dimension to it and a bit more of the history.
Okay. I've got one other. So somebody, Andrew, I think, has asked us, could you please say something about the sculpture of Lenin, allegedly buried under Bevan Court, near Percy Circus? I think this is the sculpture that's in Islington Museum.
Yes, that's right. Could I bring back up the share screen?
Indeed.
Yeah. So that's the sculpture there, and it's currently sitting in Islington Museum. I think you may know more about it, Alex, than me about the history of it. I know that for a time it did sit in Islington Town Hall, and also that it was attacked and with red paint being poured over it. And I think I mentioned that briefly in my book. But it is quite a striking bust. And I think you could probably say a few more words about Lubetkin.
Yeah, I mean, that was erected. I'm not sure who the sculptor was, actually. I don't think it was Lubetkin.
Oh, was it not?
But it was erected. Well, it may have been Lubetkin. I'm not sure if he was the sculptor. But it was erected by Lubetkin. Bertold Lubetkin was the Georgian Soviet architect who came to London. He studied in Moscow in the 1920s under the constructivists, was in the Bauhaus in Germany in the early 30s, came to Britain as a refugee in 1933, and was one of the most important pre-war and immediate post-war modernist designers in Britain. And in particular, well, he designed the Finsbury Health Centre, which people can still see just off Exmouth Market, and which was in 1937 and predates the National Health Service by 10 years. But in many ways, it signals what the National Health Service was going to try to achieve. Anyway, he built a number of fantastic residential developments for Finsbury Borough Council in the 1930s and 40s, including one in Holford Square where Lenin lived, which was named as Lenin House.
That's
and
right.
Outside of which the bust of Lenin was erected. Fascists attacked the bust during the war in the early war, 1939-1940, and the statue was taken down and allegedly buried underneath what was then called Lenin House. Post-war, the bust was put in Islington Town Hall and is now in the museum. And also post-war, Lenin House was renamed as Bevin House after the Labour Foreign Secretary,
of course,
Ernest Bevin. So, but you can still see Bevin House. It's an amazing bit of architecture. And that was a piece of public art celebrating Lenin's life in London. which I think it's interesting that they had the confidence to do that.
Of course, yeah.
Okay, I think, so that's dealt with Andrew Spire's question. And I'm just trying to see if there's anything else. I'm not seeing any further questions, but lots of people saying thank you so much for a very interesting and informative talk. So I'm going to wind up at this point, and just I'd like to thank Robert Henderson again for an original, fascinating, and really intriguing. I said it was a piece of archaeology, and it is. It's uncovering the streets and the people who lived in them in parts of London that you've walked through and cycled through or driven through over the years. And it tells us an awful lot about the way that these political circles of revolutionaries came together, met and lived. And we're very grateful to Robert for doing all that work and for coming here tonight to tell us about it. And we at the Marx Memorial Library continue to teach the ideas of historical materialism and Marxism. And we think that if Lenin came to London today, he'd want to come back to 37A Clerkenwell Green. Can I give one last plug? We've got 2 events coming up in the next month and a bit. Thursday, the 27th of August, in 3 weeks' time, we have a panel discussion on race and class with Claudia Webb MP, Roger Mackenzie, Assistant General Secretary Unison, personal capacity, and Alan Cooner. And on Thursday, the 24th of September, we have our online panel on American radical publishing with Jodie Collins and Dr. Sue Carell on the collection, the John Williamson collection at the Marx Memorial Library, which is a collection of Communist Party USA pamphlets and periodicals. If you're not already a member, please become a member of the Marx Memorial Library. I can't say it any more clearly than that. It's £25 a year if you've got a job. If you haven't, it's 15. What could be fairer than that? It's a great place. We've got loads and loads of archival material for you to look at. And we have a constant series of educational lectures, classes, and tutorials running right throughout the year, which you can find out more about on our website. Having said that, thank you so much for coming tonight. I hope you've enjoyed it. I'd like to thank Dr. Robert Henderson one more time.
Great thanks to you as well, Alex. Could I just say I've tried to answer some of the questions, perhaps not as well as I could have done. If anybody wants to contact me, I'll be more than happy to reply via email.
So just to repeat, Robert, the email address, can you just give it to us again verbally?
Yep, it's r.henderson@qmul.ac.uk. r.henderson@qmul.ac.uk. In fact, there it is. And it's in the chat, I think. r.henderson@qmul.ac.uk. Okay. That's great.
Thank you very much, everyone. It's been
Thanks
great.
to you.
And good night